This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you episode 38 of season 3 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, September 17th, 1910, and I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford that week. The week starts with the Westford Center section. Miss Mary E. Drew is at home again after a three weeks sojourn at Annisquam. Miss Raines will be the supervisor of music in the schools of this town this year, and Mrs. Brackett of drawing, that is the supervisor of drawing, the same as last year. Mrs. Nellie E. Carkin recently entertained her son, William E. Carkin of Marlborough, New Hampshire. Mr. Carkin took particular pleasure in visiting at the Congregational Parsonage. Reverend Mr. Wallace was a former pastor at Marlborough, and Mr. Carkin an attendant at his church. Mrs. Elizabeth Nesmith, wife of George W. Nesmith, died at her home in Parkerville on the Concord Road last week, Thursday morning. The funeral took place Sunday forenoon, Reverend David Wallace conducting the services. The bearers were George W. Nesmith, Harry L. Nesmith, W. H. Kent, and Wayland F. Balch. Burial was in the family lot in Burlington. The Unitarian Church, now the First Parish Church, after a vacation of 63 days, lengthened several times for church repairs, will resume Sunday services tomorrow. The newness of the interior, a rested choir, a minister fresh with an observing attitude, should welcome a large congregation who are sleepless. Lawyer James Stewart Murphy and children from Lowell have been delving for health the past week from the cool depths where hangs the old oaken bucket, neath the pine tree shades of Francis Hill. That, of course, is the home of Samuel Law Taylor. The prosperous and progressive that hold farming up to a high key at Fairview, that's in quotes, and in parentheses, not the cemetery, in parentheses, where the Griegs hold the earth to its promises, have been busy these hot September days, putting in steam heat. It will be ready when the mosquito gets his bites all in, and the frost bites take the place in the play. The Griegs' Fairview farm was right across the street from Fairview Cemetery, hence the name. The first arrival was a Miss Fitt, spelled F-I-T-T, and a Parfitt, spelled P-A-R-F-I-T-T, and for further bill of particulars, inquire of Mr. and Mrs. William Parfitt, Chamberlain Corner. This is a little confusing, but I think it's Sam Taylor's interesting way of announcing the birth of Angie E. Parfitt on September 9th, 1910, to William and Addie Talent Parfitt. There was a large non-sectarian clam bake camp meeting exercises held at Nabnesset Pond last Sunday. A light frost was reported by pumpkin vines and other tender conductors of low temperature on Thursday morning along the banks of the Crooked Stony Brook. Mrs. Alfred Hartford was also one of the party, not previously reported, with the Oscar R. Spaulding touring expedition. The next paragraph is called Has Arrived. John A. Taylor, Samuel Taylor's son, one of his sons, arrived at Grand Forks, North Dakota last Saturday. He passed through 11 states, but saw no scenery that compared with the old Berkshire Hills, which he saw directly after a terrific thunder shower on the first day out. Made a stop off at Minneapolis to take in the Minneapolis State Fair with its 100 exhibition buildings, acres of hogs, horses, colts, sheep, and other large ox creatures. In this respect, they beat Middlesex North, but for fruit and vegetables, dear old New England of Rocky Hill history has got the flavor and the finished goods. Visited one of the small flour mills of the capacity of 11,000 barrels per day, part of which was being branded for Wright and Fletcher and J. Herbert Fletcher of Westford. Those were the two general stores that served Westford's residents in Westford Center. The State Fair averaged selling 60,000 tickets per day. Grand Forks is clean, modern, progressive, with 15,000 inhabitants and no stand patters except the Roosevelt brand. This is a reference to Teddy Roosevelt, who owned ranches in western North Dakota in the Little Missouri River Valley. Grand Forks is on the eastern side of the state, so he wasn't that close to Roosevelt's ranches. The next section is the Forge Village section. Services were resumed at St. Andrew's Mission last Sunday afternoon, and Reverend Endicott Peabody of Groton School conducted the services. Next Sunday afternoon, Reverend Mr. Burkhead of Groton School will occupy the pulpit, services commencing at 3:30. Sunday school will reopen September 25th. Reverend Endicott Peabody, born in 1857 and died in 1944, was the American Episcopal priest who founded the Groton School for Boys, known today simply as Groton School, in Groton, Mass. In 1884, Peabody also founded St. Andrew's Episcopal Church in Ayer in 1899. Peabody served as headmaster of Groton School from 1884 until 1940, and he also served as a trustee at Lawrence Academy in Groton. The St. Andrew's Church in Ayer was the mother church of St. Andrew's Mission in Forge Village. Joseph A., son of Mr. and Mrs. Joseph A. Barassa, their only child, died last week Friday morning after a severe illness of cholera infantum, aged 6 months and 4 days. Funeral services were held Saturday afternoon. Burial in St. Catherine's Cemetery, Graniteville. This is the second child Mr. and Mrs. Barassa have lost with the same complaint. Albert E. Parsons disposed of his household effects last Saturday afternoon and will return to Vancouver, Washington shortly, where he intends to settle. Miss Teresa Lowther will entertain the members of her Sunday school class next Sunday afternoon at a picnic, which will be held at Hollingside Cottage on the shore of Forge Pond. Mrs. Joseph Bennett Jr. and 2 children have returned home after a visit of several weeks spent with her parents, Mr. and Mrs. E. Vicker of Stafford Springs, Connecticut. A daughter named Hannah McNiff was born Saturday, September 10th, to Mr. and Mrs. John McNiff. Mrs. Lewis, whose maiden name was Maud Eva Carkin, Mrs. Lewis Casey, C-A-I-S-S-E, and 2 children of Leominster, is visiting with her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Augustus W. Carkin. John Edwards has been confined to his home the past 4 weeks with a poisoned hand. He cut the little finger of his right hand while at work at the Chandler Planer Company at Ayer, and blood poisoning set in. It is feared that he may lose his finger. It is said that Joseph McDonald has purchased the Bradley farm. Miss Lillian Rose is attending the Lowell Normal School, where she is in the graduating class going to and from school on the electrics, returning to her home in Belmont Saturdays. The electrics were, of course, the trolley cars that ran from Westford to Lowell and east to Ayer, or west to Ayer, I should say. Miss Gladys Daly is attending Fitchburg High, and Miss Mabel Sanborn is a pupil at Ayer High. Miss Evelyn Fernald returns to Vassar College next week. Next is the Graniteville section. The Graniteville Baseball Club visited North Chelmsford on Saturday afternoon, and in a hard-fought game in which everything was in doubt until the 9th inning, met with defeat at the hands of the North Chelmsfords, the final score being 8-7. The loss of the game was due mainly to the costly errors made by the local club at critical stages of the contest, but even at that, the Graniteville club came near winning out and threw a great scare into the North Chelmsford fans by their fast work in the final inning. Mr. and Mrs. Oliver W. Sherman of Damariscotta, Maine, have been recent guests of Dr. and Mrs. Warren H. Sherman of this village. Mr. and Mrs. Frederick M. Defoe are now taking in the sights at Montreal, and they intend to be absent for several days. Miss Margaret E. Horan of Charlestown has recently returned home after having spent a brief vacation as the guest of Mr. and Mrs. William J. Healy. The date for the Foresters' anniversary dance has been set for October 14th in Town Hall, Westford. The local fire company was called out on Sunday afternoon to subdue a brush fire on land owned by Benjamin Caunter, back of the ball grounds. Between 3 and 4 acres were burned over before the fire was gotten under control. Mrs. John J. Dunn of West Chelmsford has been a recent visitor here. The Ladies' Aid Society of the Methodist Episcopal Church had a very successful food sale in the church vestry last week, Thursday evening. That's the news in Westford for the week ending September 17th, 1910. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Ryan Cousins of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org or visit the Westford Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from days gone by. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.